It's 8:30, so we're going to begin. Because thank you for joining, both in via Zoom. We are Parsha Shiur. Parsha Shiur, the fact that it has more mitzvahs in than any other parsha. So this is a Seder full of mitzvahs, but I think the very fact that we identify this parsha so strongly with the notion of being full of mitzvahs means there's even more reason to try and understand, initially at least, to look at the parsha in a sort of holistic way and try and understand that there are themes. Are there themes run through this parsha? That's a very, very important question when you look at Parsha Shiur. And the truth is, Rav Hirsch looks at the parsha and says that the main focus is, not entirely, there are exceptions, but if you look through, you find right from the beginning, when you talk about, as we'll see, we'll talk about later on about the Ben Sora Mora, we go on to talk about the Hashavas Aveda, returning lost items, we talk about, there are a lot, the various halachas to do with, for example, divorce, gerushin. You have the halachas when relationships go wrong. There's lots and lots of mitzvahs in the parsha to do with relationships. But I think there's something else here which is perhaps even more striking. When you look at many of the mitzvahs in this week's parsha, many of them are about exercising self-control. They're about using willpower in times of trial. And of course, the parsha, the greatest example of that is the very first mitzvah, your first Torah, right? The example of someone who's in battle and he's tempted by a certain woman, and all the halachas that apply in terms of trying to restrict and trying to Rashi famously says the Torah provides a solution because of the Yetzer Hara, everything else, etc., etc. And then, of course, you also have the same thing, even in mitzvahs, which could be phrased in a different way. Many of them seem to be specifically phrased and set up by the Torah in a situation where great temptation would exist. So, for example, Hashavas Aveda, the way the Torah phrases it is, Lo Yitzisalim, you show me misalim from the thing, whereas Vehisalamta, you might be tempted to, shut your eyes as if you hadn't seen the Aveda. And the Torah says, no, you're not allowed to do so. You have also another example, honest weights and measures, right? Again, it's a situation specifically of temptation. At the end of the day, the person who has dishonest weights and measures is a gunner, right? Yeah, you're stealing. But the scenario that the Torah specifically tells you to have honest weights and measures is one in which you would be most tempted and perhaps justify it by saying, well, I'm only just fiddling with the scales a little bit, it's not so bad. So this is how it is. And I think it's very, very interesting when you look at this notion of self-control and of willpower. This has been studied to a great degree by many social scientists. The most famous, perhaps, is the Walter Mischel marshmallow test. Those who know has read the book Marshmallow Test, it basically is about how self-control works. And the conventional view, and I think it's worth spending just a minute on this because it's particularly relevant to understanding our parsha. The conventional view is what was known as the strength model when it comes to willpower, when it comes to self-control. But basically, willpower is like a muscle, and it can become fatigued. It can wear over time, right? And they proved this ostensibly in experiments. They had a situation where they basically gave a whole group of, I think it was students, they said to them they're not allowed to eat any chocolate, even though they had chocolate in front of them or something like that, and they had to eat radishes. And after giving them the radishes to eat, they then gave them a set of geometry puzzles to solve. And the results of the study, broadly speaking, were harder for them. They gave up quicker on the puzzles. They had been able to do what they wanted, and then they got to do the puzzles. They were able to exert their willpower to a greater extent. Whereas if they'd already been through a certain test of self-control, so then it became much harder. They gave up much quicker when it came to the next test. But what Walter Mischel argued was, for a different reason, is basically what happened in cases like this is people just became fed up. The idea, he says, is that you need constant motivation. And if the motivation for what you're doing continuously increases, then your willpower will stay strong. Then your ability to exert self-control will stay. It's all dependent on the motivation. Anything is possible with the right motivation. That's what he argues. And I think that There's a really fascinating example of this, and perhaps the least likely source in this week's parsha, the least likely mitzvah. The Torah says that let's just find the pasuk. So, if you're following Parsha Perek of Gimel, pasuk Yud Gimel, the Torah is talking about going to war, and it says, or a situation similar to that, that there is a necessity to provide a place for a person to relieve themselves in battle, a soldier, whatever. Make sure you have a spade together with your weapons. Make sure you practice important personal hygiene when you are in battle. And you look at this pasuk and you think, what, in the middle of a war? Is this really what you're thinking about? Is this really so important? The Torah has to devote a whole parsha to it. And the answer is yes, because of the next pasuk. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there with you, even in the most intimate moments, even at times when you might think it doesn't not relevant. Who's going to see me anyway? HaKadosh Baruch Hu misalech b'kerev ma'atecha l'tzilcha, l'seiv you l'seiv sevecha l'fanecha, v'hayom achanecha kadosh, and your camp shall be holy. Even in these situations, that necessity to preserve the holiness of the machane. And the idea is that ultimately is the motivating factor. That is the endless motivation that allows us to exert that self-control, that willpower, even in the most severe of threats. So from the least likely source, it seems so mundane. No, it's not mundane. That's where the Torah specifically says, that's where it says, Hashem Elokecha misalech b'kerev machanecha. It's easy to feel Hashem Elokecha misalech b'kerev machanecha when you're in shul. When it's on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, you feel it. It's much harder when you're in a military camp and you're thinking, can I be bothered in terms of personal hygiene? Yes, you have to be bothered. And that's where you need that motivation more than ever. So to look at some specific mitzvahs, really not departing from this general overarching theme of what we can learn specifically from the mitzvahs in this parsha that have direct relevance to our daily lives. We look at the Parsha Ben Sora Amora. The Parsha Ben Sora Amora needs particularly careful study, and the reason is because, as the Torah famously, as the Chazal famously say in Sanhedrin of Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph, Ben Sora Amora lo hoya v'lo yiyah, never existed and will never be the rebellious of v'lo menichtov b'Torah elo drosh v'kabel schar. The Torah writes it only in order to expound it, to receive reward for the exposition, for understanding the psukim. So the very fact that we Chazal seem to understand this parsha is they're saying, of course it could happen, but it didn't happen. So why is it there? Drosh v'kabel schar. Understand it, learn it, and you receive a reward. So the question is, what limudim, therefore, are we supposed to take with Ben Sora? What are the key messages from this parsha of the rebellious son? So let's begin with Rashi. Rashi says here on Perek Chof Aleph Pasuk Yud Ches, Ben Sora Amar Eino Chayav at Shignav Yechal Tatimo Bosav Yishtechatzi Lo Yain. Ben Sora Amar is only Chayav in a very specific set of circumstances. He has to steal, and he has to eat a certain quantity of meat. He has to drink half a log of wine. That's what it means. Zoilel v'soivei. Ben Sora Amora nerag al shem sofo. Rashi says the Ben Sora Amora is killed al shem sofo. Higia Torah l'sof taito. The Torah goes to the end and realizes what will be at the end of where he will end up. Sof shemachale momen oviv. At the end of the day, he will end up destroying the money of his father. Mavakish limuda. He will try and achieve what he is used to. In other words, he's used to living this gluttonous life, receiving whatever he wants for his desires, and he's not able to do so. And he will end up standing on the way, and he will become a highway robber. He'll rob people, and Omra Torah, therefore the Torah says, Yom Zakai va Yom Chayav. Better that he die while he's innocent and not die while he is guilty. So what you see here, I think Rashi is trying to bring out here, and based on Chazal, is the power of dissent. descent into the wrong path begins with the smallest of things, the tiniest of things. So what does this young man do? He is zolel b'sove. He just doesn't eat properly at all. He doesn't eat in the right way. But the Torah says that the reality of life is that things don't stop there. One thing goes to another. You go from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, and eventually you never know where you're going to end up. What's interesting though is that there's another example of this in the Parsha. And that is when the Torah spells out why we have to distance ourselves completely from Ammon and Moav. So the Torah says, the Pasuk says, let's find the Pasuk. It's in Parachof Gimel, Pasuk Dalad. Lo yovei Ammoni and Moavi b'kal Hashem, gam dor asiri lo yovei lahem b'kal Hashem ad olam. Even the 10th generation shall not come into the Kahal Hashem forever. Why? Al devar asher lo yikidnu eschem balechem uvamayim baderech b'tzeischem b'Mitzrayim. Why? Because they didn't give you they didn't provide food and water when you were leaving Mitzrayim. And then it carries on. They hired Bilam to curse you, and that led to everything that we know resulted, the tragedies that resulted as a result of that. Although Hashem turned, the Torah carries on to say, we know that there were terrible incidents as a result of the znus that Bilam caused and led them that transpired. But what is striking again is that here the Torah as well spells out al devar asher lo yikidnu eschem balechem uvamayim. And the Kli Yakar says here the following thing. He says, the Dovazeh, Rashi, he says, if you look at Rashi there in Pasuk, Rashi says in Pasuk Hey, al devar, what's al devar shelo yikidnu eschem balechem? Rashi says, alo eitza sheyatzu eschem lachtiachem. The eitza that they gave was to cause you to sin, was the Bnei Moav, right? That was where Bilam was successful, right? He caused them to sin with the Bnei Moav. The Kli Yakar says the problem with that is right? It doesn't say it. Why doesn't the Torah spell it out? Right? The Torah should spell out clearly the main reason why you have to distance al gam dor asiri. Why does it have to be so long? Why does it have to be gam dor asiri le'yovalem kal Hashem? The Torah should say because they caused you to commit znus. Should say clearly. The main thing is missing. He says it also doesn't seem to make sense that just because they didn't give you bread and water on your way to get to Eretz Yisrael, that's why you have to distance them, these whole nations so much. He says has to be because they cause them to sin. Why did they not give you bread and water? He says it's all part of the same thing. They didn't give you things to eat and drink on the way, so that they should be hungry and thirsty from the toil of the way. If you look in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, this is a famous sugya in Parachelek Daf Kuvov, where the Chazal go through every detail almost of the whole Parsha of Balak and beginning of Pinchas and what happened, what transpired. And basically what it was, they made the Jewish people very weary and they had no energy and everything else, and they were thirsty and they were hungry because they hadn't given them lechem and mayim, and as a result, that eventually led them to sin. One thing led to another. So, in other words, it's exactly the same idea. It's true that at the end of the day, what these nations did was horrific. It caused this terrible sin in the Bnei Yisrael. But it started from something very, very small, from being stingy. We don't want to give you any bread and water. And as a result of that, everything else followed. So you see the same idea, both with the Ben Sora Amora and also with Ammon and Moav as well. But there is another aspect to the Ben Sora Amora, which I think is worth focusing on, and it's based on a different text in this basically different Chazal on the one Rashi brings. It's Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin Perches Halacha Zayin. Yerushalmi says, the that this young man eventually is going to use up all the property of his father and his mother. So far, similar to Rashi brings, he's going to end up stealing, he's going to end up killing people, and that's why there's no choice. Effectively, the Torah says this is what happens to become. Then the Yerushalmi adds something which is astonishing. The sofer l'shakeach es talmudoi, and at the end of the day, what's going to happen is he's going to forget his learning, and therefore, right? You better die innocent rather than dying guilty. So you see the difference. Rashi says umuvakesh limudoi ve'inamutze, right? Which means he looks for what he's used to and he can't find it, and therefore he ends up killing people. But the Yerushalmi first brings the idea of him ending up stealing and killing, and then says, the sofa l'shakeach es talmudah. And at the end of the day, he's going to forget his learning, and therefore better he should die innocent rather than guilty. So Chaim Shmulevitz says, the Pnei Moshe, actually brings the Pnei Moshe on the Yerushalmi, asks the question, what on earth has that got to do with anything, the fact that he's going to forget his learning? And the Chaim Shmulevitz says in Sichos Musa that the point here is that even after he ends up doing all these things wrong, he ends up killing people and everything else, there would still be hope for him. Adayin yesh tikva, he says. V'adayin b'koichol hashuv midarkei hara. He would still have the opportunity to do teshuvah. Ach kivon shu mishakeach talmudai, because he forgets his learning, kva ein lo derech lo shuv. He has no way of doing teshuvah. So the point here is that this individual may have drifted incredibly far from the path, but as long as he's still connected, he still remembers some of his learning, some of his background, he has a way back. But the Yerushalmi says if he forgets his learning as well, he's got no connection to the Torah at all, that's when he has no path back. And again, these limudim are, we bear in mind that Chazal, it never happened and it never will happen. So clearly the fundamental lessons here are these points. Rashi, in the way Rashi learns, in the sense that it's a pathway from the very small things to the larger things, and the Yerushalmi's emphasis on that a person can drift incredibly far, but if they're still connected to the Torah, they always have a pathway back. Let's move on to the parsha of the Kan Sipar. Ki Yakari Kan Sipar, everyone's familiar with the parsha. Ki Yakari Kan Sipar l'fanecha v'derech b'chaleitz al ha'oretz efrichim oivetzim oim revetz al efrichim oivetzim lo yistikach oim al habonim, but the mitzvah is shaleach teshalach esoim v'esabonim tikach loch l'mani tzavloch v'harachto yomim. If you look at the so the Ramban here says, he brings the Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara in Brachos says, "L'fisha osem midosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu rachamim ve'enon elo gezeros." A person who effectively says, this is it's really a mission in Brachos that says, if a person says, just like you have mercy on the mother bird, or whatever the young, not to take the mother bird whilst the mother is on the eggs, not to take the eggs whilst the mother bird is on there. So to you shall mercy on us. It turns the mitzvahs of the Torah into rachamim, as if it's the focus, the purpose is rachamim, is mercy. Ve'enon lo gzeros. There are decrees. Okay, the Ramban carries on to say that the problem is like this. If a person goes down that path and says that the reason is the fact that Hashem has mercy on the bird, on the young, not on the bird, not to take the eggs whilst the mother bird is there. First, you have to send away the mother bird. Im Kaini says it would forbid shchita. So why? How can you make these distinctions in this way? Yet we're allowed to do so. The reason why the Torah tells us to perform this mitzvah is to inculcate within us a midah of rachmanos, of mercy, v'shalonis achzor, so that we shouldn't be cruel. We know that the perspective of the Torah is that the Torah allows us to use in the right way, not obviously in a way that is not gratuitous cruelty has to be for the right reasons. We're allowed to benefit from the natural world. We're allowed to perform shechita. What is the idea of this mitzvah? The Ramban says, so in order to teach us Rachmanis, and we should not learn to be cruel. Rashbam says a similar thing. He says, he says, I explain this in the context of not cooking a kid in its mother's milk. Similarly, when the Torah says, the young and the parent and the child, the animals on the same day, because it is similar to cruelty, vera of sonus, and it looks like a person is desperately starving. It's gluttonous, it's impolite. To take and to shecht and to cook and to eat the mother and the young all together at the same time. That is the key issue. The idea is that the Torah wants to inculcate within us a notion of holding back when it comes to food. Not to act in a way that is like a Rav, someone who is, as if you're starving, hungry, I have to eat in this way. And therefore, he groups these mitzvahs together in that way. If a person eats in a way that is instant gratification, instant gratification is the main focus of a person's endeavors, that leads a person to develop a notion and a midah of cruelty and a midah of wanting things instantly, not behaving in a correct manner. I once came across a very powerful story that brought this home to me. There was about a gentleman called Michael Medved, who's I think a radio host in America, and he once told the story that he was producing something, and he was there, and he was at work all day, and he brought his young daughter was off school. He brought her with. For the day to the office. And in the office, he had a non-Jewish secretary who decided, out of the goodness of her heart, to give the little child some sweets during the day. But of course, the child, whether she was 6 or 7 or how old she was, she'd been brought up in a frum home. So she did the obvious thing, as a 6 or 7-year-old did. She said, "Wait a minute, I have to go and ask my father if I'm allowed to eat these sweets, if they're kosher or not." So she takes the sweets, she runs to her father, and her father says, "I'm really sorry. Unfortunately, they're not kosher, but I'm going to give you something when we get home, whatever." And then, of course, she did something which only a 6 or 7-year-old could do. She runs straight back to the lady who gave her the sweets, and she says, "I'm really sorry, but my father said I can't have them because they're not kosher." And at that point, that's when things became a bit strange, because the person who gave her the sweets, this is where he tells the story, that she came over to him, to the father, and said, "I can't believe the way you're bringing up your children. How on earth could you do this to an innocent 6-year-old? It's just a sweet, it's nothing. You're restricting her, you're restraining her from developing in her own way, and what on earth are you doing to your children?" And when he reflected on this story later, I'm sure he modified her and said, "Don't worry, it's just lots of sweets at home, it's fine." But when he reflected on this story later, he said, "There is nothing I am more proud of than developing, even within the youngest children, a sense that you don't have to have instant gratification in life." The idea that actually, okay, someone's giving me a sweet, but I don't need to eat it now. Let me just wait and see if it's like making brachas, right? Those few seconds when you make a bracha teaches you not to be a Rav son. And according to the way the Rashbam and the Ramban are learning the Parsha of Ki Yikorei Kan Sipar, grouping together these mitzvahs with the others, like not shechting the mother and the young on the same day, and even our whole approach to food should be one of like, we don't need to do things we shouldn't do things in a hurried way, in a rush way, in a way that appears even cruel, and that will inculcate within us the right midas in these areas. I want to finish off with one more idea, which I think ties in very nicely with all the things that we discussed today, which really, as I started off with, revolve around the same idea, the idea of exerting willpower and self-control, even in situations where it might be easy and obvious to do otherwise. And that is perhaps in the area which needs the greatest sensitivity of all. And that is, we have in this parsha, if you look at Perek Chof Daled Posuk Aleph, we have the we have the parsha of gerushin, of divorce. He found something wrong. The Torah goes on to explain how and the situation and the halachas of gerushin. And you have the famous Mishnah in Gittin. There's a machlokas tanoim. Beis Hillel say afilu hikdicha tavshilo. What does it mean? Motzov or erev astova? As a machlokas tanoim. What does it mean? He found something wrong. Erev astova literally means lewdness, something inappropriate, something immoral. But the tanoim, astonishingly, seem to take it even on a much lower level. Beis Hillel oimim afilu hikdicha tavshilo. Even if she burns his dish. Rabbi Kiva oimim afilu motza cheres noah himenu. Rabbi Kiva says, you found someone else who looks more beautiful than her. And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky and Emes Liakov asked the obvious question, why should the Torah permit gerushin to divorce one's wife because she burnt his food, or because it's even worse, in a way, Rabbi Kiva, right? He finds someone else, he prefers someone else, therefore that's enough of a reason. That's motzova erev astova. What did she do? She should be divorced. Of course, we know the last 1,000 years, they have the Chaim Rabbeinu Gershom, can't divorce against her will. But midin Torah, husband could divorce even Baal Korcha, even against her will, for these seemingly insignificant issues. But he says, Omnom Nere says, Shekan Yorda Torah Levailonu Mahu Inyan Hanisuin. What the Torah is trying to do here is trying to teach us the whole essence of what marriage is. Both partners in the marriage need to go into the marriage every day reminding each other how they are the best possible person for them. They are the most beautiful, the most wise in the world. There is no one better. And if it's true that he finds someone who is, quote unquote, to quote, paraphrase the Mishnah, more beautiful than her, must be that he's not treating her in the right way. He's no longer seeing her in the way he should see her. That's a sign, chas v'shalom, that there's something wrong. And similarly, he says, in the idea of ikdichot avshiloi, he says, the klal, the general rule is, a person can never see anything wrong about themselves, right? We all know that, right? We can never see our own faults. And if, for example, if a person would say something or do something inappropriately or make a mistake on one occasion, of course you'd let yourself off. Of course you would. You'd say, listen, I can make mistakes, I'm only human. You'd let yourself off. And if so, if he has a taina against his wife, right, for messing up the dinner that evening, that's a sign that he doesn't feel the unity between them as it should be. And therefore, that's why the pathway, chas v'shalom, is open towards gerushin. So he says like this, it's not that the burning of the dish, right, to you, Beis Hillel, that's not the cause of the gerushin, right? The cause of the gerushin is the fact that he thinks she's done something wrong, right? That this is a reason to complain. That's what it is. That is the ultimate cause. If he feels that is something to complain about, that's why it's a bad sign. And he says this is obviously a difficult thing to achieve. It is why to join together two people who are essentially different people into one person. This is, he says, the essence of why the Gemara in SEITZEI, it is harder to bring for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to bring people together than it is to split the Yam Suf to Kriyas Yam Suf, and yet ultimately, that is the greatest test of all of interpersonal relationships. So it is fitting that the Parsha of Gerushin is in Parsha SEITZEI. That Parsha, as we started with Rav Hirsch, who says that the primary theme is interpersonal relationships, and we said specifically in moments of trial, the Torah tells us to exert that self-control, to do the right thing. What greater example of that is there than in the most important relationship we have in life, which is with one's spouse. And in those situations, the Torah demands of us that we rise to the challenge, however difficult it is, in order that we can be the best possible people and that we can have the best possible relationships in life. that we can. I thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening on Zoom as well. I wish you all a very good Shabbos.
Sure. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you very much.
Emes Yaakov. That was the Yaakov on this. Okay, right. Hope you could all clear. Here they could. Yeah, you want to switch the.